Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of autism. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Steve Silberman, author of NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism. This was published by Avery in 2015. The fascinating book explores the history and nature of autism. Oliver Sacks called NeuroTribes a sweeping and penetrating history presented with a rare sympathy and sensitivity. The book has become a widely praised bestseller in the US and the United Kingdom, and it won the 2015 Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. Steve Silberman is currently working on another exciting book, this time on cystic fibrosis, titled The Taste of Salt. That seems interesting. Steve is an award-winning science writer whose articles have appeared in Wired, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, the MIT Technology Review, Salon, Shambhala, and many other publications. Steve's TED Talk titled The Forgotten History of Autism has been viewed more than 1 million times and has been translated into 25 languages. Steve also won a gold record from the Recording Industry Association of America for co-producing the Grateful Dead's career-spanning box set. By the way, I'm saying this, you can tell I'm not a music fan.
No problem.
It was titled So Many Roads, 1965 to 1995, and this was Rolling Stone's box set of the year. As a young man, he was Allen Ginsberg's teaching assistant at Naropa University. Steve Silberman, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm very grateful that you accepted my invitation.
Thank you so much, and I'm very, very honored to be asked, and thank you for the warm welcome as well.
Thank you. Why did you write the book? Do you have any links to autism?
I don't have, that's a very interesting question that is probably one of the most frequent questions that I'm asked. Yes. And it's a very interesting question that gets to the heart of the book. People always ask me, particularly when the book first came out, if I had an autistic child or if I was autistic myself. People still assume that I must be autistic to have taken such an interest in the subject. But I was a science writer, and you would think that particularly in a field where there were so many controversies about causation and vaccines and everything, that a science writer would take an interest in the subject. But people were so used to autism being thought of as being, for one thing, a childhood disorder, for one, but for another thing, so rare that really only someone who had skin in the game, as Americans say, would be interested enough to write a history. But I was just interested because over the course of about 10 years, from the first time that I wrote about autism for Wired magazine, in an article about what was then called Asperger syndrome in Silicon Valley, called the Geek syndrome, between that and 10 years later, whenever the subject of autism came up in the news, people would say, there seems to be a dramatic increase, in autism, but no one knows why. Scientists haven't figured out why. It's a mystery. It's a baffling enigma. And I thought, years are going by. Isn't anyone figuring out why these numbers seem to be going up? And it occurred to me that there was so much suffering and actual illness in the case of people not being vaccinated for, childhood conditions like measles and mumps, that someone had to take a look at the entire history and see if something went wrong somewhere along the line. And it turned out several things went wrong in the course of autism history to create that confusing situation that, in a sense, we're still in, because even now there's still controversy about what causes autism.
Okay, I mean, it's a question that occurred to me, but on its own, I think it's a worthy subject. And
yeah,
how did you approach it? How did you go about writing the book? What did you?
Well, what I did was one of the initial impetuses for writing the book was that when I wrote the article, The Geek Syndrome, in 2001, well, for one thing, I wrote it right before 9/11. And it was originally supposed to be the cover of the magazine, but because of the attacks on 9/11, it got pushed to the back of the magazine. I thought nobody would ever read it, really. But unlike any other article I'd ever written, that article got email for like 10 years afterwards. And it was people struggling with very practical day-to-day needs. They weren't like saying like, what made me autistic? They were saying like, how come I was told I was a genius when I was a kid, but I've never been able to have a job because I can't get through a face-to-face interview? Or, other people would tell me that they, reading that article made them finally understand their uncle, who would always talk about some particular battle of World War II in minute detail. So I thought, well, there's this huge population of people who are wrestling with the day-to-day needs of finding healthcare, finding jobs, finding housing. And yet, whenever the subject comes up in the newspapers, autism was presented as this baffling enigma. And if you said that vaccines didn't cause autism, which as more and more studies came out proving that they don't, you would be attacked in the comments section as being a shill for big pharma, and I was not a shill for big pharma. I had written very critical articles about big pharma for Wired over the years. But so I both knew the history of big pharma, which did include, cover-ups of bad things. But I also thought the more that I looked at this evidence, that the people saying that vaccines were causing autism were not just wrong, but the more I found out about people like Andrew Wakefield, they were shameless frauds who had gotten rich in many cases. And so one of the things that really sort of hooked me in a way, or it was the moment when I realized that nobody had looked deeply enough into this, was when a lot of the early parts of my book talk about the differences between the approaches taken by Dr. Leo Kanner, who was a child psychologist in America, and Dr. Hans Asperger, who was a child psychologist in Vienna. And it was often considered or framed as an independent discovery that they both claimed to have discovered autism within just a few years of each other. And people would say, like, what a funny coincidence. They just, both happened to notice similar behaviors in a group of children. Well, I discovered that, in fact, they shared the same assistant, this guy, George Frankl, and his wife, Anni Frankl. And so by the time Leo Kanner claimed to discover autism, Frankl and Weiss had already been working with Hans Asperger in Vienna for years. They already knew not only what autism looked like, they already knew that autism was a spectrum, and that it embraced a wide variety of people, from people who were considered very bright. One of Asperger's former clients was a university professor or assistant professor in astronomy, to people who were needed 24-hour-a-day care. So Asperger and his colleagues were prescient in that regard. Leo Kanner had a sort of a different approach, which was he was trying to establish child psychiatry as a valid field in America. And he did that in part by sort of hyping this discovery of what he framed as a very, very rare condition that would require not just the kid to be institutionalized, but the parents to be on the psychotherapeutic couch or psychoanalytic couch, really, for perhaps a decade. So Leo Kanner was really trying to create a niche for child psychiatry in America, making them even perhaps more important than parents, because in his conception, it was the parents who were causing autism. And so, the child psychiatrist had to insert themselves in between the parents and the child, et cetera. So the problem with that was that Leo Kanner's idea that autism was very rare persisted long after there was plenty of evidence that it wasn't. And it rendered generations of autistic people invisible. And so they were just hidden away in institutions. The shame of their families, because their families had been told that it was bad parenting that caused autism. So parents wouldn't mention them. So whenever, I'm a what's called a trailing edge baby boomer. I'm 67. And a lot of times people my age, like in public talks, they'll say, why didn't I, I'm your age. Why didn't I ever hear about autism when I was a kid? That's why. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you talk about it, of course, being a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the question I had in my mind is, where does that spectrum end? Where does eccentric behavior start? How do you kind of draw the line?
Do you know that, that is, I would say, the thorniest question in autism still, and always has been. And I can tell you, I can give you a definitive answer because it's not my answer. It's the answer of Lorna Wing, who was the British cognitive psychiatrist who really conceptualized the spectrum after finding Hans Asperger's paper. That's a very interesting story. Let me just take a minute to tell that story. Yes. Because Lorna Wing had a profoundly autistic daughter. Her daughter was Susie, and there were no resources for Susie when Lorna and her husband were raising her. This was before special education, before accommodations for cognitive disability. So Lorna was also launched the first autism parents movement in England. But I did one of the last interviews with Lorna. She was dying. I didn't know it yet. She had Alzheimer's disease, I believe, but she was still very sharp and very coherent when I talked to her at length. And I said, where is the bright line in the spectrum between, who is on the spectrum and who isn't? And she said, there is no bright line. The spectrum shades imperceptibly into eccentric normality.
Okay.
But here's the thing. A lot of the controversies in autism today have to do with stuff like self-diagnosis. And so, people say all these kids watching TikTok, they're diagnosing themselves with autism and, so some people, obviously people in the psychological establishment tend to come down on the side of only an official diagnosis counts. The problem is that depending on where you live and what, resources are available to you, a formal diagnosis may be 3 years away or maybe unaffordable to you. So the question is, how valid are self-tests for autism and what autistic self-advocates call peer confirmation? So peer confirmation would be like, if you get together with a bunch of autistic people, they say, oh yes, you are one of us. And all I can say is this: in the years since NeuroTribes was published in 2015, I have met certainly hundreds of people who identified as autistic at all ranges, at all points on the spectrum. And Lorna was very pointed in insisting that the spectrum was not linear. It did not run from low to high or anything like that. She said that the spectrum was more like three-dimensional, so that everybody has their own individual point in the field, of autism, you could say. And so what I would say is that of all those hundreds of people that I've met, many of whom diagnosed themselves or diagnosed themselves and then were peer confirmed, they seemed autistic to me. I've only met a couple of people who were self-diagnosed where I thought, really? I don't think so. Okay. So it's a complicated thing, but I do think that self-diagnosis is valid. And I think it's all very tricky because autistic traits are very common. And Lorna pointed that out too. And just because you have, even a couple of autistic traits doesn't necessarily mean you could get a diagnosis. So it's a very complicated thing.
And yeah, it's obvious that so many things in there. And some of the ones you mentioned was social awkwardness,
Right.
fascination with rules, laws, and schedules.
Yes.
It was an innate desire to seek out universal laws and objective principles. Is there, I suppose the answer is no, but I will ask, is there a common driver for all these different aspects of autism?
Well, I would be better qualified to answer that question if I was autistic myself. But what I would say is that for neurotypicals sort of soak up almost by osmosis from their fellow neurotypicals the rules of how the world works. And neurotypicals also, they're willing to distort those rules a bit if it makes them more comfortable or whatever. Whereas autistic people don't seem to be able to absorb invisible, the invisible curriculum is the autistic phrase, from their fellow autistics. So they need to figure out different ways of making sense of their experience. And so I have noticed, and me and many other people and clinicians and commentators, that autistic people seem attracted to densely patterned bodies of information, whether that's the layout of a piano, Wikipedia, the rules of science, the rules of art. They tend to be attracted to these systems that make sense of otherwise chaotic information. And so that would seem to me to be the primary driver.
Okay. Seeking, making sense of what doesn't make sense, I presume.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yes.
And part of it, which of course I understand it's not only people with autism that have it, is this savant phenomenon, this ability to know things that they've not been taught, or this calculator geniuses, or ability to memorize things. How do they, where does that genius come from? I read a book by Daryl Treffert who talked about inherited knowledge, that we all have this knowledge inherited from the beginning, and somehow autistic people or who are savants can access it. Do you agree with that point of view, that this inherited knowledge?
Here's the thing. There's a lot to say about this. Daryl Treffert, who has passed away, he was a brilliant man. But I do think, his neurotypical special interest was savants. And so he wrote, several books on the savant, what he called the Savant Syndrome. I do think that at least some of that writing was a little bit exaggerated or hyperbolic in that, how to put this? Those abilities are really there, but I don't think they're as precisely defined or as rare as people like Daryl Treffert tried to insist, in that lots of autistic people I know have an incredible memory for certain kinds of experience or passages of music, etc. But it doesn't make them all, these kind of rare, absolute geniuses with some kind of genetic inheritance of, for instance, there's the most famous interpreter of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach in the 20th century was this guy, Glenn Gould. If you look at footage of Glenn Gould, oh boy, he looks autistic. He's stimming. He would literally kind of dance around in the room. I spoke to a waiter who worked at his favorite restaurant in Toronto. He would come in every night when he was in Toronto, order the same meal, sitting at the same table. And so the question is did Glenn Gould inherit, some kind of knowledge of Bach's scores through his genes? I don't think so. What Glenn Gould inherited was a brain that worked in a certain way that it was able to extract all this information from what Bach passed down to us in his scores and in his music, and to get the maximum sort of emotional energy out of that information. I think speculating that people are born with, almost like a collective unconscious, as Jung said, but that's like full of rules or scientific. I don't know if we have to go there, but one thing we might notice is that a lot of times people who are considered low functioning in autism, they're the people who have these savant abilities. And I argue to scrap the terms low functioning and high functioning, even though they make a kind of intuitive sense and everybody uses them, because as a young autistic woman once said to me, if they call you low functioning, they're ignoring your skills and aptitudes. And if they call you high functioning, they're ignoring your challenges. And I think that's true. I think we tend to dismiss the challenges that so-called high functioning people have. And, to put a very fine point on it, one of the leading causes of death for so-called high functioning autistic people is suicide. Yeah. And that's because they are profoundly sensitive to the ways that they're being bullied, excluded, people are shunning them in friendships, etc. And so I tend to disregard those categories and also not spend so much time wondering about savants. But, it's a very interesting phenomenon for sure.
Well, I'll still dwell on savants with one more question.
Sure.
You did mention the portrayal of autism in arts and literature, and one of them is the Brainman. And I suppose people would think Brainman. We'll think of Brainman immediately when you mention autism. Right. Does that portrayal of Brainman, does that kind of, how will I say, shift the perception or give a wrong perception of what autism is to people who are not in the know? Does it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, here's the thing. Young autistic self-advocates now hate Brainman. Okay. They think it's a terrible stereotype. And it is. It's this it's this white guy who, counts fallen toothpicks and can win at Vegas and stuff. And so, but here's the thing. That was the first autistic adult that practically anybody in the world had ever seen. Even people within autism hadn't, in the field of autism, clinicians hadn't seen an autistic adult on screen before. Many of them hadn't seen autistic adults in their practice because it was right then that the diagnosis of autism was being broadened to include adults. So for its time, it was very revolutionary. But I want to point something out. It was not revolutionary enough. And it was because, in part, of Daryl Trefford, the doctor that we mentioned earlier, because at the end of the movie, the screenwriter who I spoke to, he originally planned Dustin Hoffman's character and Tom Cruise's character sort of live happily ever after together in an apartment. And that would have been true to the sources of the character, Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man, because they were based on people who were not in institutions. But Daryl Trefford stepped in and said, that's unrealistic. He could not survive outside of an institution. So they had to send him back to the institution at the end of the movie. But those people who Dustin Hoffman's character were based on are still living independently. One of them works at the Princeton University Library. I visited another one who's an artist, and I portray him at the end of my book. And so it was revolutionary for its time. Now it looks terrible. It's like there was, a movie about gay people in the 60s called The Boys and the Band. It was considered revolutionary for the time, but now it looks ridiculous. these stereotypes, So that's where Brainman is. Revolutionary for its time. Now it's not, it's good acting, but it's not an accurate portrayal of the range of the autism spectrum. That's for sure.
Okay, so hopefully people know it's in the fiction section
Right.
and keep it.
Right.
One of the other things that kind of characterize autism is the temper tantrums, the unusual behaviors. And I was surprised, quite enlightened as well, that these are attempts by usually these children to communicate. You said they're kind of finding channels of self-expression. And
right.
I wondered, how much is a dysfunction of communication at the root of autism? Is it kind of there, or is just one of those things?
Well, that's a very interesting question. For one thing, if there's anyone out there who is, say, a parent who is wrestling with this difficult behavior, I would recommend a book called Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism by Barry Prezant. He specifically works with autism parents on their children's behavior, but his main point is that for decades, for most of the 20th century, things that autistic people would do were sort of dismissed as symptoms of autism that should either be actively discouraged with punishment or ignored. And what he points out is that autistic behavior is human behavior. And often, if an autistic child is becoming upset, or an autistic person is becoming upset, there's something in the environment that is making them uncomfortable. And neurotypicals won't always pick up on it. Maybe it's the buzzing fluorescent lights over their desk. Maybe it's the background noise. Maybe it's that, they haven't been given an opportunity to wear little sound dampening headphones so that they don't get sensorily overwhelmed. And we wouldn't even know about sensory sensitivity in autism if it wasn't for Temple Grandin, who is probably the most famous autistic person in the world. She's an author. There's been a movie made about her. Anyway, she was the first autistic adult to come out to, in a sense, be the real life equivalent of Dustin Hoffman's character in Brainman. And she was the person who really talked about how when she was a child, she would have meltdowns in church because she was forced to wear these really itchy woolen dresses. And so she made us aware of how autistic people, she made neurotypicals aware of how autistic people experience the world. And a very important concept that an autistic scholar named Damian Milton has introduced in just the last few years since my book came out, is the notion that the lack of ability of both autistic people and neurotypical people to be able to interpret each other's emotions is a two-sided problem. It's not that autistic people fail to communicate or autistic people fail to be able to see their emotions. It's that neurotypical people are not good at judging how autistic people are feeling and vice versa. And Damian Milton has christened that the double empathy problem. And I think that's really an important concept that is now starting to inform autism research.
So it's not men are from Mars, women are from Venus, not kind of...
Right, exactly.
Neurotypicals are from, we're all in the same, just trying to...
Right.
The same, okay.
Right.
The other thing you talked about was the self-stimulation in autism. And you mentioned this 11-year-old child, Leo, who uses bright green Starbucks straws to stimulate himself. What's behind this? If they are sensitive, why would they want to stimulate themselves? Is that a contradiction?
Well, when you say sensitive, that doesn't necessarily mean that they want the world shut down or quiet all the time. Okay. I know some autistic people who love roller coasters.
Okay.
So like they'll ride a roller coaster 10 times. Every autistic person is different with different sensory needs. Some, can hardly handle any sensory stimulation. Others crave it. I don't know why. I don't have the first person perspective, and there hasn't been really research to determine why autistic people self-stimulate. But what we now know that we didn't know in the 20th century, when the concept of self-stimulation first appeared in psychology, it was being talked about by a guy named Ivar Lovaas, the behaviorist who invented what's called applied behavioral analysis for autism. He has a mixed legacy because he did help get autistic people out of institutions, but he also advocated for very, very brutal forms of punishment, including electric shock, to extinguish self-stimulatory behaviors. Now we know that autistic people use self-stimulation as a learning aid, like it actually helps them focus. And if you're mostly focused on autistic people should look neurotypicals in the eye because neurotypicals look each other in the eye, and so autistic people should be held to the same standards of behavior, that it's actually harder for them to absorb what you're saying if you're having them, look you in the eye. So it turns out that there are distinctively autistic ways of learning and behaving that neurotypicals don't quite understand yet, but it helps them get through the world and be comfortable and manage their own energy levels. And Leo, you'll be glad to know, the kid in the book, who's now, I think he's 20 now. He's a wonderfully happy kid. He's still primarily non-speaking, but because he has been raised in what I would call a neurodiversity affirming family, he is a very, very happy kid. And so he and his mom go on hikes, and she knows what he likes, the snacks that he likes and stuff. And so, when people say like, oh, sure, the high functioning autistic people, they can work at Google, but, the low functioning, we have to use, terrible, no. Neurodiversity, meaning respect for who the person is and the distinctive ways that they have of learning, is the best prescription for coping with any person on the spectrum.
And is the communication difficulty they have purely verbal? I've kind of read where some
not purely
by typing or other ways of.
Oh yeah. No, there's a wonderful film that's available in the US. I assume it's available online. It's not through one of the major streaming services, but the film is called This Is Not About Me. And it's the story of a young woman named Jordan Zimmerman, Jordyn Zimmerman. So just Google that. It is a wonderful film because it's a film about a young girl who was completely written off as unteachable by her teachers. Her parents were told that she would have to live her life in an institution. She was very angry. She was, had these explosive rages, and nobody wanted to work with her until she was finally introduced to a group of teachers who supplied her with a keyboard and taught her how to type her thoughts so she could finally express herself. She became a lot less angry, a lot less rageful. She went through school. She just got her master's degree in special education. Wow. So instead of living her life in an institution, she's going to be teaching special education using a keyboard to type. So, that's a great resource.
It just goes to show what you said. It's change the environment. Don't try to.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Okay. You introduced your book, I think, with Henry Cavendish very early in the book. You talked about this eccentric 18th century philosopher who, amongst other things, discovered hydrogen. Do you think he's autistic? He was autistic or eccentric?
I do think he was autistic because I have read so many accounts of his behavior by his contemporaries, where they say stuff like, the best way to address Cavendish is to not look him in the eye, let him stand off to the side and look towards the wall, and then you can hear what he says. And he was so anxious about social engagements that even at meetings of his friends, he was called a natural philosopher, but that's just because the word scientist hadn't been invented yet. He was really a scientist in a sense. And so he would go to meetings of the Royal Society, but once he got to the steps, he would be so anxious about going in that he would have to wait for someone else to come out and open the door before he could, sort of propel himself up the stairs. There was so much observational detail about Cavendish. And I spoke to both Oliver Sacks and Uta Frith, who were, are considered, well, Oliver's has died, but Uta is considered a world's leading authority on autism, one of the world's leading authorities on autism. And they both believe that Henry Cavendish was diagnosably autistic. Obviously, some of the things that he might have done could be written off to eccentricity, but it was the word syndrome means things that occur together. And there were so many things that occurred together in the life of Henry Cavendish. But the important thing to remember is that if he hadn't been born to a wealthy family, he would have spent his life in an asylum. He would not have been able to build these laboratories or build these libraries. He had a library of science books that was available to like people in the Royal Society, but you were instructed not to try to talk to Henry Cavendish if he was there. So, he was able to, in a sense, live out a dream of what a neurodivergent person's life could be if they were given the resources to pursue all of their interests. And in doing so, he absolutely transformed the world and laid the groundwork for many different, not just discoveries, but schools of science, as I talk about in the book. But none of that would have happened if his family didn't have a lot of money.
And I mean, we can project this to today. How do parents without resources actually manage? Because Leo, for instance, I think his mom could kind of have the resources to do all.
Oh, definitely, yeah. No, yeah. Leo's family, is upper middle class and definitely has privilege, and they know that very well. They don't hide that or anything. It's very, very difficult for parents with limited resources to find what they need. It depends on where you live. It depends on what country you live in. In America, we don't even have as many complaints that I'm sure are valid about the NHS. We don't have the NHS in America. And so, for people in areas where there hasn't been much investment in providing appropriate resources, it's very, very difficult if you can get your child a diagnosis at all. And for adults, it's like so many times people say to me, like I practically beg people not to ask me for referrals because I'm not a clinician, I'm not qualified, I'm not, I'm a historian. But adults looking for resources to help them get through life are really, really scarce. So I would say that we're just at the beginning of hopefully what will be a transformation of society for people with cognitive disabilities, where they're more accommodated in the same way that we accommodate physical disabilities in places where we do. So, at some point, it would have been considered ridiculous for people to say, who needs wheelchair ramps and access to public buildings? Someday science will make it possible for everyone to walk. That's what we've been saying about autism and cognitive disabilities in a way. Someday we'll figure out what causes this and fix it. Well, what about making it possible for kids to learn with their peers? etc. So I've been advocating for accommodations and adaptations of society, and then we can figure out what are the things that you can't fix by making society a more comfortable and accommodating place for people with cognitive disabilities.
And are there, I mean, for neurology, we have big charities for Parkinson's disease and dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. Is there a similar thing with autism? Kind of people?
Yeah, there are, but many of them are problematic. Like the biggest autism charity in America is called Autism Speaks. And Autism Speaks was started by anti-vaccine activists in Hollywood who had a lot of money. And so their initial rollout was autism was horrible. It's an epidemic. We have to figure out what broke, in the human genome or the environment, and then fix that. Once autistic people could speak for themselves, they didn't like being portrayed as broken people, and now one of the presidential candidates in America, Robert Kennedy Jr., his vice presidential candidate, Nicole Shannon, they both routinely describe autistic people as zombies, shattered families, etc. So some of those beliefs are still in circulation, but at the same time, many, many parents all over the world are discovering that if you believe that what your child is doing is attempting to communicate and to respond to the environment in a way that's human and not just something to be dismissed or punished, people are discovering that neurodiversity affirming society creates happier autistic people.
And interesting, you mentioned the aspect of, we've visited twice, how much the mothers of people with autism were blamed for them autistic children. You talked about this refrigerator or schizophrenogenic mothers.
Right.
And this this was all from Kanner, was it? Was it Leo Kanner?
Kanner sort of, there was a big demonization of women after World War II in America because women had been not just invited into the job market, but encouraged to aid the war effort. But then all of a sudden, when the troops came home, when the male troops came home from World War II, there were all these women having jobs and living independently. And so there was sort of a societal shift to insisting that women would be happier at home and raising kids. And there was a lot of blaming of women for psychological problems in the family, particularly ambitious women. And so what Kanner did was he, in part of his effort to make child psychiatry so important, he interpreted what were probably autistic behaviors on the part of mothers, which Hans Asperger had already figured out. Hans Asperger said that the mothers of autistic kids were often unusually close with their kids because they had similar traits. But for Kanner, these women were these over-ambitious yuppies who were, striving to work when they should have been home raising their kids. And so Kanner sort of climbed on the anti-mother bandwagon and blamed them for autism. What's interesting is that, he was not, I've been saying a lot of bad things about Kanner, but he was also, in a way, a hero in that the way that he ended up working with Asperger's assistants was that he saved them from the Holocaust. He and his wife were Jewish clinicians, and they saved Jewish clinicians from the Holocaust by promising that they would find jobs for them when they came to America. And so that's how Hans Asperger's assistants, George Frankl and Anni Weiss, came to be working with Leo Kanner. So Leo Kanner was a hero in many ways, but he also, unfortunately, contributed to this idea of refrigerator mothers.
And talking about heroes and villains, what about Asperger and his links?
Yeah. Here's the deal. Asperger was working in Vienna, as I mentioned. Up until 1938, his clinic was a very humane and progressive place for autistic people, because what Asperger and his colleagues were doing were trying to find ways of reintroducing their clients to society. So they would have classes. It wasn't just a clinic. They would have classes. They would put on plays. They had a garden. They had music. So it was an environment in which autistic people could, in a sense, relearn how to be people by being in an accepting environment. But then the Nazis took over. In 1938, German soldiers marched over the mountains into Austria to claim the country for the fatherland. Several of Asperger's bosses were already Nazis. The ones who weren't at that point either quit or committed suicide to avoid death in the concentration camps. And Asperger was one of the very few of his colleagues who refused to join the Nazi party. But here's the thing. At least two of his patients he did send to a place called Am Spiegelgrund, which was one of the killing centers in Austria. It wasn't a concentration camp, it was a clinic. But the parents of those kids were fervent Nazis who begged him to do that. And there has been, I would say, a commercially driven attempt to exaggerate Asperger's support for the Nazi regime, promulgated by the authors of a book that was competing with mine called In a Different Key, and another book called Asperger's Children. Both of those books, I would say, both exaggerate Asperger's adherence to Nazi ideology and also downplay the fact that the Nazis learned how to be eugenic from us. Many of the Nazi programs were based on American thought by people who thought that genetic conditions like autism and schizophrenia should be snuffed out of the human gene pool. And so America was more complicit in eugenics than either of those books really admit. The other thing that very few people know, and I'll write about it someday, is that one of Asperger's closest colleagues, a guy named Joseph Feldner, hid a Jewish boy through the war in his own apartment. And everybody in Asperger's clinic knew it. And when that kid grew up, he wrote his name was Hansi Buston. When that kid grew up, he wrote an autobiographical statement in which he talked about the core of anti-Nazi resistance in Asperger's clinic. And so now Asperger has been sort of tarred with the brush of Asperger was a Nazi. A, he refused to join the party. B, yes, he did probably send two kids who ended up being exterminated. That's, there's no excuse for that, except if you were a medical professional trying to work under Hitler. There was a group of medical students in Germany who made a public demonstration against the Berlin eugenics laws. They were called the White Rose. They were publicly beheaded. So I think probably what Asperger thought, and I'm speculating, but I think he thought, well, if I stay in my position, maybe I can save some of these kids. But he couldn't save them all.
You tried to ride the tiger, but there's
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You touched about the links between autism and vaccines, and of course, in the UK, we had the link with the MMR vaccine, which was all fraudulent. Andrew Wakefield was the pediatrician, I think, who did these studies that linked autism with the MMR vaccine. But he managed to publish his papers in really high-profile scientific journals. How much do you think science itself played a part in promoting these pseudoscientific beliefs?
Well, yes. I believe Wakefield's initial paper was published in The Lancet, and it was a hugely public relations managed event. He had a news conference at which he overstated the findings in his paper. It came out later that he had an alternate formula for vaccines that he had a patent on an alternate formulation of vaccines that he was trying to popularize by demonizing the MMR. Yes, scientific journals, as I talk about in my book at great length, scientific journals at every stage, sort of confirmed or popularized or hyped or exaggerated or whatever theories of autism that turned out not to be true. But that's also how science works. In Andrew Wakefield's case, he was an absolute fraud. And, I don't think he was just an earnest scientist making a mistake at all. But sometimes earnest scientists, make mistakes or glom onto the wrong theory, and then they're disproven. And that's why science is good, because you can, go after something that you think is not right and then prove it with data. So I think it's inevitable that science occasionally gets things wrong, but the frauds come in when even once something has been proven wrong, they continue to insist that it's valid, like Andrew Wakefield and the anti-vaccine crowd.
And yeah, it's one thing to be fraudulent. It's another thing to promote an idea that damages the health of so many people who stop taking the vaccines, or stop giving their vaccines. One last thought about Leo Kanner. You did mention that many of his ideas were wrong, but they stayed there. They persisted for such a long time. Was he such a big man in the field? There's no contrary voices in.
He suppressed he suppressed contrary voices. For instance, he didn't even acknowledge the work of Hans Asperger until very late in his career, when he said in a book review, of all places, he said, "Oh, that syndrome that Asperger talked about, it was something completely different." So Leo Kanner, one of the reasons why he portrayed autism as so rare was because it made him the unchallenged authority on the subject. And in the book, I talk about how he had done that before with a certain form of syphilis. But the insistence that autism was rare did a number of disservices to autistic people. And one of them was by making people like Leo Kanner and other people too, like, there weren't a lot of contrary voices all along in autism, in part because there weren't a lot of voices speaking up in autism. And so it was only once we realized that autism was actually quite common, in fact, that other perspectives, and now in particular, the perspectives of autistic people and autistic clinicians, are starting to inform the future directions of autism research.
Interesting. Then another name which I've never heard of before, which apparently played a very big role in the history of autism, is this Russian psychiatrist, Galina Sukara.
Yeah.
She did a lot of work even long before Asperger. Is that so?
Yeah, she did. She wrote descriptions of a group of teenagers who were, I might say, charmingly autistic in a way. These teenagers had what would certainly have been diagnosed as Asperger syndrome later. And she wrote about them in Russia in the early years of the 20th century. And her work was overlooked for a couple of different reasons. For one, she was a woman, and female clinicians have always had struggle to make themselves heard. For another, she didn't coin a term for the behavior of the student. Like, she didn't call them autistic or use the word autism. So searches on the words like autism and autistic would not have come up with her work. She considered what those kids had as a form of schizophrenia, and so that was a confusion that persisted throughout the 20th century, because Leo Kanner too believed that childhood autism was sort of the prodromal phrase of adult schizophrenia, that was one reason why he recommended institutionalization. But that turns out to be completely wrong. That there are two completely distinct conditions with distinct etiologies. But so, her fate was to be mostly forgotten through the 20th century. But I made a very conscious effort to write about her work in some depth and give her the respect that she deserved.
Which is very good. Good to know about her. Then, how many of the geeks in Silicon Valley do have autism?
Yeah, this is what I think, and I somewhat part company with Temple Grandin on this. She claims that Steve Jobs was autistic. I met Steve Jobs. I don't think he was autistic. What I think is that a lot of people in Silicon Valley have autistic traits. And as we were talking about before, there's no bright line between autistic traits and a diagnosis of autism. Really, the bright line is, are you struggling? So Bill Gates, when I met Bill Gates briefly once a long time ago, and he definitely had autistic traits. He was practically stimming when I saw him. He was rocking back and forth. These were famous descriptions of his behavior. Does Bill Gates need a diagnosis of autism? I don't think so. He's one of the richest men in the world. He's fine. If he's struggling in his personal life, then go for it. But it depends on where you draw the line. And so one of the things that happened while I was writing NeuroTribes was that I read a book called The Silicon Syndrome, which was written before the diagnosis of Asperger syndrome became popular, about Silicon Valley in its early days. And when I read it, that so many of the descriptions of what the early Silicon Valley people were like struck me like descriptions of modern day autistic people. For instance, one of the complaints, it was written by a family therapist, and one of the complaints that wives in Silicon Valley would come to this therapist with was that if there were problems in their marriage, their husbands would, quote unquote, seek data like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. And so after reading the book, I called the author and I said, do you realize that you could practically just change the word silicon to the word Asperger? And it would be a book about Asperger syndrome in Silicon Valley. And that had struck her. But at the time she wrote it, it wasn't even considered possible that successful adults could have, autistic traits, much less autism. So I think it's that autistic traits are very common in Silicon Valley. I've definitely, when I spoke at Google in London, many, many, many parents came and said that they worked at Google, and that their children were autistic. And in talking to them, many of them seemed to have autistic traits to me. So I do think that hypothesis that technological communities act as magnets for people with certain traits, and then they might, their genes might become concentrated in a way that produces more children with autism. I have not seen a definitive disproof of that theory yet. And that's really Simon Baron-Cohen's theory. But so, I think it's possible, but I think it would be overstating it to say, oh, everybody in Silicon Valley has autism. And, even if someone does have autism, what does that mean? Elon Musk claims that he has Asperger syndrome, but one thing Elon Musk does not have that almost every autistic person I've ever met practically has had, not all of them, but many, is a sense, deep commitment to social justice. Autistic people are very sensitive to unfair treatment of other human beings. And, that's how Elon makes his living, by treating human beings unfairly. So anyway, I think that while it's a very fruitful path of thought to consider how autistic traits have contributed to the progress of science and art and music, that to say, well, they're all autistic, both diminishes the support that autistic families need, and also makes it too blurry and too inclusive.
So what you said about fairness, sense of fairness by autistic people with autism, and then you mentioned Simon Baron-Cohen, who I think has the theory about empathy deficit in people with autism. Or am I getting it wrong? How do you marry?
Well, you're not getting it wrong, but he has evolved.
Okay.
Yes, he was one of the original people who started talking about empathy and autism, and not in a way that helped autistic people, I would say, but he listens and he's open to feedback. And so I would say that he's reformed his position, and now he talks about the difference between sort of intellectual empathy and emotional empathy, and claims that autistic people can be very empathic. They just get there through a different process of sort of intellectual understanding of the situation. And so, Simon wrote a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy, which included descriptions of autistic people. I don't think that was a good title, personally, because even though he explains at great length in the book that he doesn't suggest that autistic people lack empathy, if you write a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy and it's partly about autism, people are going to make those assumptions. But I think Simon actually has been learning a lot from listening to autistic people over the last few years.
One last, if you can give me some recommendations of further reading, any 3 books you can recommend?
Oh, sure.
Many already.
Yeah. There's a wonderful, hilarious book that was written in England by a guy named Tom Cutler called Keep Clear. That is a memoir of having Asperger syndrome. There's a book called The Electricity of Every Living Thing by an autistic woman in England named Catherine May. I recommended earlier Barry Presents Uniquely Human for parents who have kids with challenging behavior. I would also recommend A History of Autism called We're Not Broken, written by Eric Michael Garcia. That is a book I could only have dreamed about being written when I was writing NeuroTribes, because it's the history of autism and a personal history through autistic eyes. So that's another great book.
Through autistic eyes. Thank you very much. Steve Silberman, thank you very much for your time on this Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful for your attending. And to my audience, thank you so much for listening or watching the podcast. If you found it enlightening, you might want to check out my own book called Surfing the Brain, or check out for a bit more neurology on my database called NeuroChecklist. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, why not subscribe to the iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube channels? Thank you until the next episode. And thank you, Steve Silberman. I'm very grateful for the time you've given me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Take care.